Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Monday, Day 0. Beginnings. From the words of Mr. Raymond. I awoke one morning to the sound of my pager rattling on my nightstand. Work as usual. Though it was odd, it was 4:37 a.m. on a Sunday. My first reaction was anger, then sadness, but after buttoning up my emotions and suiting up myself for the oh-so-lovely place of chemical cookings, I strolled out to my car and headed through town to work. Upon pulling through the gate and booth, I was stopped at my parking space by a man in a deep black suit and sunglasses. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but you are needed in Bay C8 today. Please proceed there immediately and enter the black van." I easily complied. We've tossed around government or CIA ghost stories here before, and none of them ended well when someone questioned the authority giving the instructions. I drove to the location he specified, parked, unloaded my gear, and looked around for his supposed black van. When I finally found it, another man in a suit told me to suit up and gear up with the supplies to my right. Complying again, I went to the locker room for Bay C and got ready. No one was around, and not a single sound was to be heard. After this, it really started to sink in that something was eerily wrong today. Something about the atmosphere didn't feel right. As I multitasked getting ready, combing my hair and thinking about dem life struggles, I slipped on a stagnant puddle of water and hit my nose on the edge of the sink. The taste of bloodied copper entered the back of my throat almost immediately, but before that even hit, I had already jammed tissue into my nostrils. Time was of the essence, of course. After taking a few extra minutes to ensure the bleeding had subsided, and I looked decent enough to roll out, I left the locker room and started heading back to the black van. Though it was now parked right next to the door, no one was in the driver's seat and I could hear whispers from the back. I hopped in, and inside were two of my coworkers, Matthias and Jerome. "Raymond, what the fuck is going on, man?" I could only shrug my shoulders at Jerome and tell him it was business as usual. We then heard the doors lock and the engine start up. There were no windows in the back cab, only a bench on each side, a rack of supplies, and a radio. The van started moving and accelerated extremely fast out of the garage. It was then that I started jotting down the directions we were headed in, the time between turns and all that other jargon. If we were to be sandbagged and left for dead in the middle of Elko, Nevada, I'd at least like to leave a few breadcrumbs to crawl my way home with. After what seemed like hours of driving, listening to Jerome bitch and moan, and Matthias sharpen his pocket knife, we came to a stop on uneven, hilly ground. We were in the middle of the fucking boondocks. We heard a coughing noise from the front compartment, then the driver's side door opening, and then a banging on the wall. "Listen up, all three of you. You're upstate now in the Adirondacks. There's a little town about 12 miles from here, just due southeast. A lot of crazy locals have been reported to have gone down with a specific illness and croaked. We want you to investigate this designated site for a week. I'll be back to pick you up at 800 hours next Monday. Record every thought you have, and every out-of-place thing you find around here. You are not permitted to use lanterns outside of your tents at night, and you are not permitted to leave this square-mile property, especially do not head north. If you leave this property, you're on your own. Whatever you see and whatever happens is on you." Am I clear, Matthias, Jerome, and Raymond? We all yelled out in agreement as the doors unlocked. We grabbed our gear, exchanged faces of confusion and remarks about the situation, and promptly left the vehicle, only to find that our driver was now gone as though he had simply vanished. There was a metal government sign at the edge of a trail stating, "Site half-mile down trail." We started lugging ourselves down, and as we came across our setup of 3 large dome tents, a patio table, and an ominous barbed wire perimeter, I realized I forgot my phone on board, as did they, strangely. I told them I would go retrieve them on my own, and they would get everything ready and go over whatever vague orders we were given. Upon returning to the beginning of the trail, I saw that there was no truck, nor tracks, nor road leading away. Only a clearing enclosed by the woods. Something was terribly off about this whole situation, and I could already smell the fear resonating off me. I headed back in a sort of fast walk, and about halfway down the trail, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a rush of nopes flew down my spinal cord as I started feeling like I was being stalked. Every time I stopped walking, I could hear a crunch of leaves in the forest, and whenever I looked around to listen, there was not a single bird to be heard chirping or a cicada to be buzzing. I booked it back to camp, and as I cleared through the brush, I saw a military Humvee parked outside our disturbing retreat. Now shit was serious. Sergeant Shitface and his private, Corporal Fuckhead, were sent out here with the same deal as us. Vague information, locals acting up, and a gas drop next Monday at 8. They were sent here as bodyguards for the most part, but were just as whacked out as we were. If only I knew then what we were all getting ourselves into. Tuesday, day 1, recon. I awoke to the fragrance of butter on flapjacks cooking in the dewy morning, and as I exited my tent, I was greeted by both officers cooking breakfast for all of us. I forgot to mention, their names were Dan and Marco. I woke the other 2 bumbling recluses from their slumber, and we all feasted on the glorious pancakey goodness. Sadly, we had no syrup or blueberries, but the many Iraq stories Marco told us were more than enough to fill in the missing pieces of breakfast. After we finished our meal, we started planning out the week. Today, me, Marco, and Dan would survey the land in the Humvee, and the other 2 would start collecting samples on a checklist packed into their bags. Tomorrow, Marco and Jerome would head west to collect samples. Dan and Matthias would head east to collect those samples, and I would get to sleep in, hold down the fort while I waited for them to come back. We really didn't think past the moment before the 2 NRA bugs got eager to head out and start questing. As we headed out, Marco stuck on a Spanish radio station to lighten the mood, and he started cracking jokes about how all of this could have been New Aragon if the English hadn't been such fanboys to the Spanish Armada. As we were driving along, we paid close attention to the layout of the land. As we headed north, I reminded them not to go too far, though their commanding officer had warned them about it as well, so there was no fear of crossing the line. We did end up driving all the way to the edge of our territory, which was marked by a mile-long barbed wire fence, the same as the one back at camp. I pulled out a telescope, and we started looking out at the forbidden land. At the horizon was an old concrete structure. Half of it had fallen into rubble and some of it looked charred. Too bad we couldn't go questing in it though, I thought at the time. We surveyed the rest of the patch of land and headed back to HQ to have supper and shoot the shit over a roaring flame. As we exchanged stories and ate, I felt that same feeling I did on the path the previous day. Our tents were huge, so I suggested, mostly out of my own fear, that the gun nuts could bunk with us instead of their shitty back seat. Matthias refused to let anyone in his palace of leaf worship, so Jerome let Marco use the right side of his tent, and I let Dan use the left side of mine. I turned my lanterns on outside so I could find my way to the shitter, in case I had an anal evacuation at 4 a.m. or something. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a familiar crunching of leaves and the silhouette of a convulsing man, limply holding an axe, appeared on the side of my tent. I nearly shrieked like a little girl, but Dan was apparently awake too, and had put his hand over my mouth to shut me up. He grabbed his handgun and a combat knife, then knocked on a piece of wood, Morse code, to communicate with Marco, who was apparently also awake. The figure paid no mind to the knocking and kept strolling around the dying fire, sniffing out everything he could find. After a while of knocking, Dan handed me the gun and told me to hold up in here while he and Marco went out to deal with our guest. But before they could get out there, Matthias had already donned his war cry and flew out of his tent with a katana at the man. All of us ended up leaping outside to see the events unfold, and there we saw horrified Matthias literally pissing his pants in fear at the man near the fire. It was an old gent, like a chubby farmer Santa Claus type, only his beard was completely burgundy with dried blood, and his left cheek was missing. He started roaring like a gorilla at us, then he charged at Dan. Before he could slice Dan's head open like a cantaloupe, I shot him in the chest. This proved to do absolutely nothing, as his locomotion was greater than that of a moving freight train at this point. He lunged onto Dan, into the side of my tent, completely collapsing the shit out of it. Marco was on him within 5 milliseconds, stabbing the old man over and over again, then pulling him off to recover the now shell-shocked Dan. The old man was down for the count, and we were all on edge as the howling of animals went on in the background as the sun rose in the distance. Wednesday, Day 2, Investigation. When the sun had risen and the dew had settled, we went to work doing what freaked-out government workers do best, dissecting the fuck out of the crazy and reporting the casualty to command. They told us this was what we were sent out here for, and that everything due north of us was quarantined. It made sense now. This fucker was stalking me along the path and was causing all those nopes through the night. Matthias and Dan stayed behind to collect data on the man, while me, Marco, and Jerome would go about our schedule collecting data from the east. We headed out in the Humvee, and Jerome, like the jackass he is, climbed up on the disabled turret and started gunning down imaginary Wendigos. We stopped at a clearing we had marked the day before, and started setting up a perimeter of barbed wire, as well as our analyzing and collection equipment. We suited up in some good old hazmat and got to work. I started off digging up soil samples and collecting the leaves of Fraxinus nigra and Fraxinus americana, whenever I could find nice enough samples of them. Everything sort of felt rough though. The textures on the leaves were off, the soil felt crystalline, and Marco even said the air was a tad dry. After a few hours and several pounds of samples, we headed back to HQ with our findings for further examination and documentation. Strange enough, they gave us vague information on collecting naturally occurring species. Stranger though was the fact that none of it seemed to have mutated in the least. Where was the problem up here? Were we one of many teams investigating every aspect of the area? Once we returned, they had already gutted the man, identified him as a local, and determined he had come down with influenza, of course. Either this was some wobbly, stabby, take control of your brain type of influenza, or I was on a need-to-know basis now. Trust was dismal, but thankfully Dan pulled me aside, feeling the same way about Marco. Marco was his senior officer, apparently. Anyhow, I started to feel a partnership form between us, and we decided to stick together now. No knives in the back for us. We all sat down for lunch and devoured a fantastic meal of MREs and instant orange juice. Delicious, right? As was now our custom, we started planning out the next few days after we had finished eating. While we were gone, Dan and Matthias had received word from command that we were to head into town tomorrow to talk to a few specific people that had either come down with the illness or knew someone who did, and to collect samples there. We were to take the samples back to HQ as usual and scan them. After lunch, Marco, Matthias, and Jerome headed out west to get that bullshit done, while Dan and I stayed behind to finish up the sampling from the east and to bullshit as usual. We talked about a few things: life, home, drones, but eventually we ended up talking about the quarantined north. Just what the hell happened? What was that concrete structure? I could feel some questing going on, but he said it was too risky for a 23-year-old pseudo-biologist to go lurking around a probably abandoned structure in the middle of an active illness zone. He wasn't much better, though. He was only a year older than me, fresh out of the military. But I took his advice and went back to my work. Before I could really dig in, though, he grabbed my shoulder, told me to get down behind our sampling tables. We both got down, and then the smell hit. It was like someone had stuck fresh roadkill in a blender and dumped it all over their body, with a hint of tang and metal somewhere in there. Dan looked over the table to see where it was at, currently on the other side of our barbed wire. Thankfully, though it looked like it was tearing itself up trying to get in. Unthankfully. Dan came back down and told me to keep quiet and that he would go over there and down the fucker. He lifted his head up again to make sure it hadn't gone across. And it was gone. He came back down, said it must have scampered off, though we should still stay alert. We got up, fixed the perimeter, and radioed Marco and company to get their asses back here as quickly as possible, which is about where shit hit the fan. As I set the radio down, the smell came back, and a large, inhuman howling sprang from the woods around us. After that, there was almost a stampede of wildlife rushing out of the woods and down the path towards town. Foxes, rabbits, squirrels, deer, bears, all just charging up the path in fear of what was coming. We were literally frozen in fear by this point, as the wild animals probably were too. Once the stampede subsided, all you could hear were the retching screams of mindless people and the smell of shit and blood all over them. There were at least 4 trying to break through the perimeter, and Dan was doming them all off one by one. It seemed like more and more just kept coming, though. By the minute mark, Dan had downed about 8 of them, while another dozen were still trying to break in. Out of nowhere, Marco and company rolled up in the Humvee and helped Dan take the rest out. After this entire ordeal, we were definitely done with this shit. We grabbed a few things, ran up to Marco, and pretty much said, "We're fucking done. Let's nope the hell out of here." To which he replied, "We have no gas left, buds. We're supposed to wait till Monday for a gas drop. We're pretty much stuck out here." My heart sank into the deepest crevice of my chest. I was saying to myself, all hope is lost. They all just started laughing at me, though, like I was nuts. "You're scared of this shit, bud. It's just a bunch of slow-moving crazies trying to nab at your innards. You were never sent on one of these details, eh?" Me and Dan weren't laughing. Were we the only sane ones left up here? "Fine, we'll clean it all up for you then, Puss in Boots." I flipped them the bird and went into my tent for the night. No way in hell am I continuing this day any longer. Thursday, day 3. Suspicion. Sometime in the night, Dan must have come in because when I woke up, he was snoring a few feet away from me. I got up and went outside. No glorious pancakes today. In fact, everyone was gone. Even better, the entire HQ was neat and orderly, like yesterday had never happened. The Humvee was where it had been the previous morning. Everything seemed exactly the same. I looked in everyone's tents. No one. Then I noticed a paper on the table. Scrawled on it, most likely Marco's writing, was a message detailing how they were walking south, down the path, to collect those samples, and once they got back, we'd all be heading to town, some 12 or 13 miles away. I woke Dan up, and his reaction to camp was no different than mine. We decided we could no longer trust the others whatsoever, and we would stick close on the way to town later on. He handed me his knife and told me to hold on to it, telling me I had to learn to defend myself sometime or another. After about an hour and some breakfast, the others returned with a literal knapsack of random shit, none of it even on the list. I swear, there must have been at least 3 decapitated rabbits in there, probably a lot more nopes I'd never want to see. Jerome seemed a tad jittery, like he had an itch all over or something. Matthias acted as he usually did, silent, playing with his knife, and Marco wasn't cheery at all. In fact, he was sort of an asshole today. Did the crazy-ass bullshit from yesterday finally hit him? I had almost forgotten any of that happened, what with the camp being spick and span and all. We all then headed off, down the path towards the lovely town where these things were spawning from, joyful to say the least. Along the way, I tried talking to Jerome, but whenever I said anything, he would just laugh and thrust his chest out like he was heaving or something. After a while, Dan just grabbed my shoulder, looked at me, and shook his head. We came across an old, downed bridge going over a little creek. Me, Matthias, and Dan just hopped across, but when Marco and Jerome tried doing it, they just fell flat on their asses in the middle of the water, and then they started screaming at each other. Matthias hopped down there, helped them both up, and got them up our side of the bank. It finally hit me that those two were most likely infected now, and I'm sure Dan and Matthias knew too. Marco and Jerome kept grunting and laughing at each other in that heaving motion along the way, until we finally reached town. It was pretty quaint, with a classic Main Street old Victorian houses and a river running through it. It was bustling with people going shop to shop, jogging or heading off to work, as any town would have. As we walked down the street towards a home on the other side of town we were supposed to visit, I noticed many of the shops were blacked out and closed. Some were even boarded up. The house we had to go to apparently had 3 occupants, an elderly couple and their son. The mother had apparently come down with the illness, and the father had reported it. Matthias and I were the ones to walk in and get information. Dan would go to another residence nearby, and the Marco-Jerome duo just sort of wandered off. We knocked, showed our badges, and were let in to discuss the situation and take samples. Nothing in our contract forbade us from speaking of our experiences, so we pretty much told the old man he should get the hell out of Dodge before shit hit the fan. After that, we examined his sleeping wife. Her skin was very dry, almost cracked in some places, along with the heaving associated with this illness that we'd observed. We took a few hair and saliva samples, left the old man to his dues, and wished him good luck. Before we could leave, though, he asked us, "Don't you want to check on my son, too?" As he pointed to his basement door. Matthias and I definitely got a taste of the nopes from this, but we would go see their son as well. I told Matt I'd go check on him, as I had the weapon, and he should stay up here just in case. I walked down the steps and saw his son just lying on the ground. He wasn't breathing. His computer was still on and was open to WebMD, so now we knew he was sick too, and now most likely dead. Well, I guess I said most likely too soon, because as soon as I started heading up the steps, he sprang up and gurgled some incoherent war cry at me, and then proceeded to wobble in my general direction. By this point, I was immune to being frightened by these freaks and promptly kept walking up the steps and out the basement door, locking it behind me. "Sir, your son is infected and is officially nutso. I suggest you vacate your house immediately and head somewhere safe. Your family is brain dead and flesh hungry." He actually took what I said to heart and got out of Dodge before I could say anything else. Smart old fool. We got the hell out of there, locked the windows, doors, and radioed Dan about the situation. He then promptly told us to walk a few blocks over to him and to take a look at the lovely scene he came across. We found him sitting on a bench, sipping on cherry coke and laughing his ass off. He pointed forward, and there we saw Marco and Jerome standing bow-legged, clawing at pigeons, sort of like the dude from Shaun of the Dead. Matt yelled out, "You guys coming with us back to HQ, or are the pigeons going to give you a ride?" My sides were gone at the scene before me, but before I could soak it in and feel good for once, Dan sprang up and started breathing heavily. I couldn't even ask him what was wrong before he grabbed me and Matt and started sprinting out of town. We didn't stop moving until we got back to HQ. I felt like falling over and dying from exhaustion. Dan then told us Marco had apparently ripped into Jerome's torso and started pulling out his insides like goddamn confetti. "All of you need to calm the fuck down and realize this is what we sent you out here for." The radio buzzed. "Continue the fucking mission, or else El Chapo and Senor Ortega down in Juarez can deal with you." We all stood up, a little less frightened but still screwed up in the head after what had been happening. We decided to fortify the camp as best we could while we finished analyzing all of the samples. Dan and Matt pushed the Humvee in front of the gate, with the front facing outwards. We gathered some logs to reinforce the barbed wire walls and created a series of snares and traps around the surrounding area. Dan fashioned a few torches as night fell. Matt made the fire, and I set up the lanterns. We weren't sleeping in the dark with these fuckers roaming around, marauding for some flesh to feast on. We also took the turret off the Humvee and set it up on a small mound between our tents for maximum range and coverage over the cleared area. Dan gave both of us a rifle and ammo supply and showed us how to operate and clean one. Dan also showed us how to SOS through Morse code, just in case. We ate dinner and quietly proceeded to bed. Dan said he'd stay on watch duty through the night. He figured he would sleep during the day while we continued our sample work. During the night, I was awoken by the sound of my tent flap unzipping and Dan laying down for some sleep. I didn't blame him, and I felt safe enough with the new barriers outside. I thought earlier that he was doing a little bit too much for us anyway. Then a while later, I thought I heard Dan coughing, like he had lung cancer or some shit. Before I could really put much thought into it, I said, "Fuck it," and went back to sleep. Friday, day 4. Fortification. I woke up the next day and again no pancakes could be seen or smelled. I turned over and saw Dan bundled up in a shit ton of blankets. Was it really that cold during the night? Anyway, I walked out of the tent, stretched, and promptly took my morning piss in some bushes off to the right of camp. When I walked back into HQ, I saw that Dan was still sitting in his chair, asleep, with his rifle next to him. Then I looked inside my tent and saw him laying in there. I zipped up the tent flap and woke Dan up to tell him the situation. First, he asked me if I got into his stash, but I guess when I replied with, "You have a stash?" a sort of trigger clicked in his head, as he unleashed a salvo on my tent, under 5 seconds later killing whatever was inside. The shriek started again, coming from inside the tent as well as the smell that we'd already grown used to. What came out of the tent could only be summarized like this: a bloody fucking mess. You could faintly tell it was Marco in there, but so much was, well, missing or deformed that you could hardly tell it used to be him. As it slithered out the side of the tent, what seemed like rubber was being left behind by it, and before more shots could be fired, it was already in the deep woods. After noping out, we inspected the rubber-like skin and the bloody chunks left inside the tent. The skin looked exactly like Dan and fell apart at the touch. The bloody chunks were dissolving extraordinarily fast as well. I still can't believe the thing slept next to me that entire night. We all tried to calm down and plan our next move, which involved Dan and Matt heading north for the rest of our samples and me holding down camp and finishing the sampling. I agreed and they headed off. I sat down and was sort of on edge for fear that a bloody mass of shit would ambush me and try to steal my fucking butter. After breakfast, I continued research on our samples. Jerome and Matt had done a terrible job. Most of it was ruined. I started on a few samples that hadn't been touched yet, and immediately after examining them, I noticed that texture again like I had the first day we collected this shit. Upon closer examination and testing, it appeared to be a filmy residue crawling with bacteria and microbes. I examined many of the other samples and even our dissected man-friend from a few days prior, and all of them were coated with this crap. I went to my tent and collected some of the dissolved matter from the Marco mess, and even it was full of this crap. Well, we now knew what was causing all of the problems around here. A fucking bacteria. I poked around the man's body some more and found that most of his brain had rotted away. There, in that rotted husk of biocomputerness, was the highest concentration of the shit throughout his entire body. The bacteria was literally eating away at his brain, leaving only a few sections such as the brainstem. So they're fucking zombies, I said out loud to myself. No, there's no fucking way. That's too cliché and predictable for something like this. And just as I said that, Dan came running over the clearing at the camp, screaming his bloody lungs off. Where the fuck is Matt? He tried to corner me in the middle of fucking nowhere, Ray. I helped him into camp and tried to settle him down. Basically, what happened was Matt went off to do some business, and when he came back he started giving Dan one of those 1,000-yard stares, then started convulsing like his gut was choking on a brick. After a little while of settling down, we then heard another scream come from beyond the clearing. Matt's. He came running just as Dan had, and once we got him settled down, he told us Dan had followed him and started mumbling random phrases to him in a sort of demonic voice. Well, you guys met your fucking doppelgangers and I discovered bacteria all over the area, and I think it's what's causing all of this. They seemed more interested in gutting whatever messed with them, though, it seemed. Did you guys even get any samples? Of course we didn't. We got spooked by some shape-shifting beasts. We continued to argue for most of the day. Then finally, we went over my findings and we all came to the same consensus. Bacteria be screwing up in these woods. After this, we started to feel much better about the situation, until we were reminded that a giant mass of bloody flesh was slithering around in the woods, something bacteria probably couldn't make a human body do. Matt took the night watch this time, and Dan and I headed to bed in Matt's tent a tad earlier than usual. Saturday, day 5. Ghosts. I awoke in the morning to find that Dan had already started cooking breakfast and Matt had been inside his tent, picking up a few things. Sorry to wake you, just gathering some shit up for the hike today. Hike, I replied. Yeah. We went over it last night. It was your idea, Ray. We're hiking back to town to hopefully have somewhere safe to hide until Monday. I don't remember talking about any of this. I just remember us bitching and then you sat out on watch all night as me and Dan went to bed early. Ray, you stood watch. You came into my tent this morning and told Dan to finish up the shift, and then you got some sleep. Which reminds me, see anything hilarious last night? I was closing in on the deep end now. There was a snake-like mass of organs and military garb slithering through the woods, looking for me at this very moment, a strain of bacteria infecting and killing people overnight, which somehow hasn't affected either me, Dan, or Matt. And now I was apparently losing my mind. "Matt, I think I'm going loco. I don't remember anything." Dan walked in and cut me off. "Breakfast's ready, morning sleeping beauty." As Dan exited the tent, he gave me a blank stare, then pointed at Matt. God damn, was he gone too? Me and Matt proceeded to exit the tent, eat breakfast, and prepare ourselves for another long hike to town. God knows why. Before we left, Dan pulled me to the side and asked me if Matt said that I was outside keeping watch last night. I told him what he said to me, and we then decided to confront him about it. "Are you both nuts? Ray was outside last night and so were you. He came in as dawn was coming, kicked me out of the tent, and promptly fell asleep in my space." We didn't want to argue, and I felt like Dan knew more than me anyhow, so I trusted his judgment, and we set off again. We pretty much take the same path as before, and as we close in on Creek with the downed bridge, me and Dan give each other a look, and we both proceed to watch Matt as he crosses the creek. Once he reaches it, he hops over just as we did. No falling into the water or any screaming. "Oh shit, Matt. We totally thought you were infected back there, though you didn't scream like a redditor when you hopped across the water, so we're good." Good, replied Matt, in almost the same tone as Dan had spoke. We shrugged it off and kept going along the trail, which eventually led off onto the shoulder of a highway. We strolled down the highway, and I noticed Matt having a hard time walking after a few miles. "Need a break, bud?" Break. "Well, all right then, Dan, let's stop. He needs a break." We all stopped on the side of the highway for a bit, and after a good 5 minutes we decided to continue on. Before we could make more than a few steps, though, we saw an overturned car on the side of the road that we somehow hadn't managed to see before. It was an old sedan, coated with bumper stickers. Sitting bloody and mangled in the driver's seat was the old man from town. He was missing both arms, his jaw, and I'm pretty sure his dinner was spread across the windshield. Seeing so much of this tier of BS so far had made me pretty immune, but seeing his jaw missing definitely made my stomach turn over all over the ground. We wrapped up what was left of him in a tarp nearby, set it in the bushes, and stuck a marker on the side of the road as a makeshift funeral of sorts. We pressed on towards town after that. Nothing too out of the ordinary for the rest of the walk. Once we made it to town, it was vacant in every sense of the word. There were smashed-out cars littered through the streets, and the pleasant sounds of shrieking and glass breaking off in the distance. It truly was a quaint little mountain town. There was a woman pushing a shopping cart, crying out that demons were afoot, a few fires along the sides of the street, the usual war zone-esque image we all have burned into our minds. Was this the zombie apocalypse? A contagion? The supernatural? It was as if evil itself was walking in the skin of all that was thought of as good in this small corner of the earth. We proceeded on, looking through the town for anything that could help us at this point, mainly gas and ammunition. To be honest, we didn't have a hard clue why we came back. It was mainly Matt's idea from what I got out of our conversation earlier during breakfast. But still, why did he want us to come back? "Let's search that house we were in the other day, guys," exclaimed Matt. Now the nopes were seriously going off. "Why? So you can drag us into that basement, kill us, eat us, and move on to other victims?" As I said that, he started heaving and convulsing heavily, throwing up everywhere. His side split open, and the familiar red muck poured out and started slithering right towards us. Dan and I opened fire, unleashing a storm of iron on whatever this thing was trying to be. We reduced it to a heap of bloody shit on the ground, and then made our leave from that wasted piece of earth. We decided to jack a car instead of walking all the way back to HQ. If you're wondering why we didn't just leave, the government would have hunted us down if we got away and spoke about this ordeal before it was green-lighted for the deep public domain. And as we passed the many miles of ill-fated walkers on Earth, we both didn't say a single word. We'd already been through so much that nothing else could have shocked us at this point. We just gunned it back to HQ in hopes we wouldn't be followed. When we finally arrived, I booked it out of the car and into my tent to grab more ammo and some alone time. Dan eventually told me to come out around sunset. He had set up a fire, cooked some food, and set up the radio for local broadcasts. What a week, huh? Yep. Dan reached for his handgun and began telling more military stories. I've seen some crazy shit. Got held down for 3 days and nights, listening to his stories for most of it. Had a bear charge at me once when I was up hunting with my dad. I used to go hunting and camping with him a lot. He sort of influenced my life like a role model. I know that's normal and proper, but without him, I'd probably still be some little kid who never accomplished anything. One memory sticks out though, not really related to anything I just said other than the camping. A few months ago, maybe a year, me and a few buds got together out west for my military bros campout with his sister and her friend. We were all having a great time until some freaky ass shit started happening. We got chased all the way back to the house by something. That's the only way I can describe it. It was clawing at the door and making a shit ton of noise. Scared the shit out of all of us. We even shot through the door at it. It eventually just scampered off into the night, I guess, though. After that, I took some time before I'd go out at night again. I ended up researching the thing too. Some crazy schizos on the internet call them goat men, fae, or whatever. That first night we were out here and that old man crawled his way onto our property, this was the first thing I thought about. Dan, that's creepy as shit, but I hear you. Stay quiet. Stay down, Dan whispered as he cut me off. He pointed over to the moonlit hill just a few yards away, and on top was a wriggling mass. Our friendly neighborhood sack of slithering bullshit came back for some love and hugs. We watched in awe as it took shape in 3 forms, that of Matthias, Jerome, and Marco. They all just blatantly walked into camp, sat down on chairs, then looked at us and proclaimed, "We'll clean it all up for you then, Puss in Bootsin'." Over and over again, as they did their heaving and laughing. That was it. We both hit full crazy right then and there and started randomly firing in their general direction. Fuck, Dan even threw a grenade at them. But it must have not done a damn thing because before we knew it, we were being circled by all 3 of them, galloping along the soil like wolves or something. We were stuck in the middle by the campfire, and they were circling us. Oh, did I mention we were also out of ammo? We were fucked. Then out of the woods, the old man from day one emerged with the skins of a bunch of people hanging from his head and back. In his right hand, he held his axe, and in the cavities and holes we cut into him was blood-drenched matter and bone meal. Game over, man, fucking game over. Dan finally gave up, it seemed, but I wasn't ready to be devoured by some pseudo-undead entity. I acted on instinct and picked up a log from the fire, then proceeded to chuck it at the old one closing in on us. He caught fire and started screaming bloody murder. It was like a pig squeal, only amplified hundreds of times over. He was literally melting into a crisp in front of us. The 3 others vanished off into the woods, hopefully out of fear. You boys better get the fuck out of there. We've got all the info we need now. Book it, fellas, you have 8 minutes before we start firebombing that entire area. The radio buzzed before finally shorting out and going dark. Dan and I both looked at each other and raced to the car we jacked earlier. "Where do we go?" Dan asked. All I could mutter was, "Nowhere we've already been, they'll bomb the shit out of it." And then it both hit us, north. There was that old abandoned concrete structure. We could use it as shelter against the flames. He revved that thing up and didn't stop driving until we were at the doorstep of the building. We got inside, guns in hand, and watched in awe as bombers flew overhead, dropping firebombs on the 20-mile radius of land around us. Everything was burning and the shrieking just wouldn't stop. The smell of blood faded away, as did my consciousness. I awoke to Dan telling me to get the hell up. Someone was here. We stepped outside, and it was the man I met nearly a week earlier. You 2 have seen more than what was necessary, but you were also intricate in solving this biological crisis. We thank you for your service and are sorry for the losses you've endured. Do not tell anyone about the events of the past week until we deem it fit to do so. Am I clear? We both nodded in compliance and boarded the black SUV driven up here and away back home. Fast forward a few weeks. Dan and I were now renting out an apartment as he promptly left the military and laid low for a while. I was let go from my job and given a sum of money to live off of for a few years, as well as a weekly paycheck for as long as I kept my mouth shut. I've told you this story now because that deal is done, and anyone I tell will think I'm crazy anyway. All I know from this is that the government and the big corporations know about what's out there, what Dan told me about. They want to have that power, to induce primal fear into everyone. And when they tried to do it, they failed miserably, because I'm still here.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.